All right, I see the room is filling up. I do want to thank everyone for joining. We're going to give it just a moment to let the room fill up. We have 134 attendees who registered, so we want to allow ample time for everyone who has been waiting in the waiting room to enter the space. And of course, we thank you for your patience. It's currently 6:01. We have about 27 people here. And we want to wait just a moment to see if we can get a little bit more time for people to enter the space that we're in the waiting room. Just a moment. Thank you. Okay. Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you for all your patience. My name is Jerry Dietrich. I am a public participation specialist with the California Department of Toxic Substances Control, or DTSC. I'll be the facilitator for this evening's information and feedback session. And we're going to go ahead and get started now. Slide 2, please. On behalf of the California Department of Toxic Substances Control, we welcome you to this second information and feedback session on the sea level rise guidance to DTSC project managers for cleanup activities. As a follow-up from our first webinar, our goal for this evening is to introduce the document to our new attendees and to provide an open forum for all of you to share your thoughts on the document. For those of you who joined our first webinar back in March, welcome back. Presentation slides for this event are available online at www.dtsc.ca.gov/climate-change. For questions from the media, please contact Devin Hutchings, Public Information Officer from the DTSC Office of Communications. Her email is devin.hutchings@dtsc.ca.gov. For your convenience, we are putting all of this information in the chat for you. Slide 3, please. Okay, so by participating in this event, you do understand it is being recorded and that the recording will be posted on the Sea Level Rise webpage as soon as it's processed. For this reason, you may be muted for background noise during the Q&A. We have the chat set up for one-way communication to provide a stationary place for us to share with you all of these clickable links, phone numbers, and emails that'll come up throughout the presentation. And we're also going to be sharing some meanings for some of the acronyms and key terms that we'll be using during the presentation. We invite you to use the Q&A box to share your thoughts, comments, and questions at any time. We will do our best to get to everyone, but if we run out of time, your question on the guidance document will be answered using the email from your registration. We thank you so much for your patience and understanding, and we will continue on to the next slide. Slide 4, please. This slide explains some of the acronyms and key terms that we'll be using throughout the presentation. Sea level rise will often be called SLR. VA or SLVRA, Slurva, sometimes called, stands for Vulnerability Assessment. AP is Adaptation Plan, and OPC means the State of California Ocean Protection Council. If you're able to view the slides from the webpage, you'll have these definitions readily available. For everyone else, we'll be posting the definitions into the chat for you for your reference as we move through the presentation. Slide 5, please. Tonight's event is convened by the California Environmental Protection Agency's Department of Toxic Substance Control, and our commitment and pledge is aligned with our organizational mission to protect California's people, communities, and environment from toxic substances, to enhance economic vitality by restoring contaminated land, and to compel manufacturers to use safer consumer products. Slide 6, please. Our agenda for this evening includes an overview and background of the Sea Level Rise Guidance document, followed by information about the document itself. We will also be reviewing the Sea Level Rise webpage, where you'll find the guidance document, an online mapping tool, and other resources. The remainder of our time will be dedicated to hearing your questions, comments, and feedback on the document. During our first webinar back in March, we received many inquiries about individual DTSC sites, their specific situations, and what this guidance document would mean specific to those sites. The recording of the first webinar is available on the Sea Level Rise webpage for your review. And for today, our goal is to share the guidance document with you as a tool that each of our DTSC project managers will be using as part of their review process. So if you have a question about a specific site, we request that you contact the site's project manager. But of course, if you don't know who that is, you can email us and we will provide you with that information so that you can get your specific question answered. Our Q&A panel for questions and comments on the guidance document includes DTSC Sea Level Rise team members, Jerry Ahrens, John Bystra, Dom Forrester, Greg Neal, and Eric Vanderbilt. In addition, tonight, we also have a guest panel member, Ella McDougall from the California Ocean Protection Council, or also called OPC. Slide 7, please. Our presenter for this evening is Dominic Forrester, who goes by Dom. He is the Supervising Hazardous Substances Engineer and Federal Facilities Unit Chief for DTSC's Site Mitigation and Restoration Program. Dom, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jerry. So as Jerry mentioned, my name is Dom Forrester. I'm not only the Federal Facilities Unit Chief, but I'm also the Sea Level Rise Initiative Team Lead, which is why I'm here today to discuss our Sea Level Rise guidance with you all this evening. Slide 8, please. Okay, so first, an overview of our guidance. We prepared our DTSC Sea Level Rise guidance for project managers, or just simply guidance, as I'll call it, which was made available to the public on February 13th, 2023 on our DTSC Sea Level Rise public website. We're making our guidance available for public review and comment all the way through October 31st of this year. We want to ensure folks have the opportunity to review, fully digest the contents, and provide feedback. The guidance establishes a framework based on best available science for DTSC project managers to ensure that they are consistently evaluating sea level rise at the contaminated sites that we regulate. The Sea Level Rise guidance is for internal use and not designed for our sister agency use, although many of our sister agencies have had the opportunity to review and comment on the document. Finally, we plan to upload example sea level rise vulnerability assessments, or SLRVAs, and adaptation plans to our DTSC public Sea Level Rise website in the future. Just a note to the audience, many of the acronyms and links that are referenced during this presentation will be included in the chat. Slide 9, please. Okay, so moving along with some background information. In 2010, the California OPC adopted the State of California Sea Level Rise Guidance document. It has been updated in 2013 and 2018 and is also planned for updating this year in 2023. This document provides a framework for state agencies like DTSC for incorporating sea level rise projections into planning, permitting, investment, and other decisions. And then in 2021, the Atkins Senate Bill 1, the Sea Level Rise Mitigation and Adaptation Act of 2021, was signed into law by Governor Gavin Newsom, which led to the 2022 State Agency Sea Level Rise Action Plan for California. This action plan is described as a living document that fosters accountability and collaboration for planning and implementing sea level rise action over the next 5 years. Due to the importance of addressing sea level rise and doing our part to protect public health and the environment, and to ensure that we're consistently addressing the sea level rise issue, we developed our sea level rise guidance. Slide 10, please. So a bit of additional background. Climate change poses a real threat to contaminated sites through a variety of mechanisms, including rising sea levels. And while there are certainly other climate change related phenomena that we are concerned about, such as wildfires, flooding, and extreme heat and precipitation, Addressing sea level rise is something that we need to, as I mentioned before, ensure that we do consistently throughout the state. Based on OPC projections, approximately 310 active contaminated projects under DTSC purview are vulnerable to sea level rise by the year 2100. So when we want to ensure that remedies at the contaminated sites that we regulate are resilient against inundation and groundwater rise. To do this, we will be asking the responsible parties, or RPs as they're called, to conduct Slurvas. If throughout those assessments we determine there are remedies which are not resilient, then we want to ensure that RPs develop adaptation plans to ensure that those remedies can become resilient now and into the future. Without addressing sea level rise, encroaching water could mobilize and potentially transport contaminants from coastal DTSC sites and in their surrounding communities. And in order to meet our mission of protection of public health and the environment, that is something that we simply cannot let happen. Slide 11, please. Okay, so what's included in the DTSC SLR guidance? Well, the SLR guidance is an internal DTSC guidance that will be used to ensure we are addressing sea level rise at the contaminated sites that we regulate and oversee consistently, working to fulfill our mission of protecting public health and the environment. We're following OPC guidance and recommendations for planning targets. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. The approach we are taking is to address sea level rise is not new either. In fact, several sites, including Maryland Naval Shipyard, Selby Slag, Hunters Point, and Treasure Island, to name a few, have been addressing sea level rise for years. Guidance describes how a DTSC project manager or other DTSC personnel would evaluate sea level rise with a two-step process. First, a Slurva is performed, evaluating site vulnerabilities and remedy resilience to assess whether sea level rise will likely affect the site in the near term or future. If the Slurva identifies a vulnerability or vulnerabilities that would suggest the site is or may be impacted by sea level rise, an adaptation plan will be required to adapt a potential future or existing remedy to ensure that it becomes resilient. So for each stage of the cleanup project lifecycle, DTSC PM should be considering sea level rise. For example, during an RI, we want to ensure that sea level rise is integrated into the conceptual site model. As part of the FS or feasibility study, we want to ensure that costs associated with sea level rise are incorporated into the alternatives evaluation. For 5-year reviews, we want to consider sea level rise and evaluate how sea level rise could potentially impact remedy protectiveness. We also believe that public engagement is very important. We've developed a webpage. As part of our commitment to transparency, are having the second public information session to be transparent and to learn what issues related to climate change that the public is interested in that we may have previously missed. As mentioned before, we will be making our guidance open for public comment all the way until October 31st of this year. We plan on updating the guidance in first quarter 2024, approximately 2 to 3 months after comments have been received, and then as needed based on best available science. Public comments received will be addressed by topic and responses will be posted on our public website. Slide 12, please. So we've been coordinating with many other sister agencies. Our guidance was provided to the OPC, state and regional water boards, Department of Water Resources, Bay Area Conservation and Development Commission, as well as the California Coastal Commission. We've also been involved with the Sea Level Rise Collaborative, formerly the Sea Level Rise Leadership Team, led by the California Natural Resources Agency and OPC. We've also participated in the Governor's Office of Planning and Research, Interagency Resilience Working Group meetings, and also the Integrated Climate Adaptation and Resilience Program. So although our DTSC guidance was developed to be used internally, we consider alignment with our sister agencies a critical aspect to address sea level rise at contaminated sites. Slide 13, please. Okay, so I mentioned California OPC planning targets a few slides back. So for planning targets, we essentially have two approaches. The first is to utilize the minimum planning targets established by OPC within the Sea Level Rise Action Plan, was finalized in 2022. Those minimum targets are 3.5 feet of sea level rise by the year 2050 and 6 feet of sea level rise by the year 2100. Second approach is to utilize probabilistic tables, which are included in California OPC Sea Level Rise Guidance document of 2018, which I mentioned is going to be updated this year. For that, we will use tide gauges based on geographical location. So for example, the San Francisco Bay Area. Those are used to derive a value based on risk scenario and time horizon. The two scenarios that we're using currently, which are referenced in the flow chart, which I'll show on the next slide, include medium high risk scenario and extreme risk scenario. So these scenarios will also need to include king tide and storm surge events as well. Slide 14, please. So for this slide, we wanted to show you the flow chart that is included as an attachment at the end of the guidance. What this flow chart does is it guides the project manager in deciding the need for a Slurva. There are a few decision points, including is the site high risk? What is the remediation time frame? All of which is to help the PM establish a sea level rise planning target. So essentially, this flow chart exists to help PM decide whether a Slurva is necessary and to help establish a sea level rise planning target. Slide 15, please. Okay. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about Slurvas and adaptation plans. In case it was not clear, Slurvas and adaptation plans are typically going to be developed by the responsible parties and only reviewed and approved of by DTSC. They do not need to be a standalone document. Whether they're a standalone document is going to be driven by the complexity of the site. A Slurva can simply be a statement that sea level rise was considered and determined not to be a problem. The Slurvas, however, must address and include all remedy elements and effects, as well as address all sea level rise remedy impacts and identify sea level rise remedy non-impacts. So for example, could a site's SVE system be short-circuited by an infiltration of salt water? How would contaminants potentially be mobilized and transported into a surrounding community? Should a site that has land use restrictions with waste left in place above unrestricted use levels instead be excavated and disposed of? So these are but a few types of impacts that need to be considered. Slide 16, please. So for Slurvas, we're really comparing two timelines. The first is the timeline in which waste is left in place above unrestricted use levels, or the time frame that remediation will occur. The second is the timeline at which we're predicting sea level rise to have an impact based on our planning targets. So let's say a site will be remediated in 10 years through in situ chemical oxidation. Well, then sea level rise is not going to be an issue likely because it's more of a longer term situation that we're planning for, not an acute event necessarily. However, if your site will remain capped into perpetuity and is within 2 feet vertically of shoreline, then that's potentially something where adaptation is needed, such as excavation, disposal, and site restoration prior to sea level rise impacts. So Slurvas assess whether there are vulnerabilities and if adaptation is necessary, whereas adaptation plans describe the plan to address the vulnerability to make a remedy resilient to the effects of sea level rise. And again, both of these documents will need to be reviewed and approved of by DTSC. Slide 17, please. So in general, to ensure we are consistent in how we evaluate our cleanup sites against sea level rise, we're utilizing this basic approach. First, we assess vulnerability of the remedy's elements and site's infrastructure. Second, if we determine a remedy is vulnerable, we evaluate measures to potentially increase that remedy's resilience to sea level rise. And then finally, we want to assure that the remedy's capacity to adapt to sea level rise, which helps the remedy continue to be protective of human health and the environment. Slide 18, please. Okay, so a little bit about our DTSC Sea Level Rise webpage. The Sea Level Rise webpage is located at www.dtsc.ca.gov/climate-change. It also identifies the planning targets that DTSC is using to evaluate sea level rise at our sites. It includes a discussion on how the guidance is being implemented at DTSC and the vulnerability assessment process. It also includes links for people to be added to the sea level rise email notification list, to get feedback on ways the public can engage with DTSC, to get feedback on the guidance document itself, to give any feedback to a DTSC email address specifically for sea level rise. Slide 19, please. And in case it wasn't evident, that link was included in the chat. In addition, we also have an online mapping tool. All DTSC sites can be evaluated with this online tool, but DTSC's focus will be on those sites that either A, lie within areas where sea level rise can flood the site, both from general and sea level rise increases or increased storm surges or wave events, and B, where groundwater is shallow enough that sea level rise could cause groundwater to come into direct contact with site contamination, which could potentially increase risk or hazard at and near such a site. DTSC will be updating this web tool with new information and as it is learned from new science and projections about the environment. Slide 20, please. Okay, so that is it for me. So I will now be passing the presentation back to Jerry. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks so much, Dom. So we're now on slide 20 for the question and comment portion of tonight's event. This slide shows how you could ask your question or provide your comments and feedback on the guidance document. To use the Zoom audio, use the raise hand feature located in the Zoom toolbar. Some versions of Zoom will display a reaction section, and then the raise hand is like within there. For anyone calling in by phone, you can press *9 and raise your hand to join the queue. And then when I call on you, you'll press *6 to unmute your line. If you have questions that you want to be read aloud, you can use the Q&A feature on the Zoom toolbar. And before we begin, I'd like to reintroduce our panel for this event, beginning with the DTSC Sea Level Rise team members, Jerry Ahrens, John Bystra, Dom Forrester, Greg Neal, and Eric Vanderbilt. Plus, our guest panelist, Ella McDougall from the California Ocean Protection Council. As a friendly reminder, our Sea Level Rise guidance team is ready to respond to questions on the guidance. If you have specific questions about a specific site, please contact the project manager. And if you're unsure of who that is, go ahead and give us an email and we will let you know who that person is. And for right now, we're going to go ahead and start with raised hands. I see a raised hand by phone number ending in 562. You can go ahead and unmute your phone by pressing *6. And if you could state your name and your affiliation before you ask your question, that would be great.
Yes. My name is Carolyn Graves. I live in Richmond, California. And I have a general question. Perhaps the OPC person could answer it, but I'll leave it open to the panel. There has been a lot of news about the Greenland ice sheets melting faster than expected, both this year and in prior years. And when those melt, the heights from those glaciers are estimated between 7 to 10 feet alone for those ice sheets. At what point will OPC share publicly that they are considering this ice sheet plus the Antarctica ice sheets, etc., in revising their sea level rise estimates for different parts of the globe? Thank you.
Thank you, Carolyn.
Sure, I could take that. So the ice sheets have been included in the 2018 guidance. They're also included in the upcoming 2023 guidance. They're being considered in the, I believe it's the medium, high, and the high scenarios for what's coming out in 2023. I am not entirely sure which of the probabilities and projections they're included for the 2018 guidance, but they have been included and they are wrapped into the scenarios that will be coming out in the new updated science for 2023.
Great, thank you so much, Ella, and thank you for that question, Carolyn. Our next person with their hand raised is Mike Vizier. You can go ahead and unmute your line and go ahead and ask your question or state your comment.
Yeah, hi, I was just wondering if this is being applied to installation or restoration projects or military superfund projects, but it might be a better way of saying it.
Good question. Dom?
ForsterDTSC, I can take that question. Yes, we are in fact asking that coastal military sites where sea level rise could potentially be an issue we are asking that they consider sea level rise as part of the cleanup process for both MMRP, in fact, Military Munitions Response Program, and Installation Restoration Program, or IRP sites. So that's something that we're requesting that the military perform as part of their cleanup process at MPL sites.
Great, thanks so much, Dom. Our next person with a raised hand is Jen Colt. Please go ahead and unmute your line and ask your question.
Yeah, hi, thanks for taking my call. My name is Jennifer Carlton with Humboldt Baykeeper, as you can probably guess, up in the Humboldt Bay area. And my question is about the flow chart on the last page. The first items, the first question says, is the site within 6 feet of the shoreline, or is contamination within 6 feet of groundwater rise? And I'm wondering where that number came from, in particular within 6 feet of the shoreline, because if you have ever been to Humboldt Bay, you know, I guess I'm having a hard time picturing that a site that's 7 feet from the shoreline would not be vulnerable. And so I was just wondering if you can explain that and you know, try and help me make sense of it.
I'm ForsterDTSC. I can respond to that. We've had a few comments related to that issue within the flow chart, and we're going to clarify that when we say 6 feet of shoreline, what we mean is 6 feet vertically from shoreline. So if it's a beach that extends out a mile, but yet it's only 5 feet from the vertical from where the contamination is located, then that site wouldn't be an issue. So when we say within 6 feet of shoreline, what we mean is within 6 feet vertically of shoreline. Does that answer your question?
Oh, I think we lost her. Let me try to find her. Sorry. Here we go. Jen, go ahead.
Thank you. My other question is whether the guidance will be recommended for use by the regional water boards, since most of the contaminated sites in Humboldt County and especially around Humboldt Bay, the regional water board is the lead agency on those sites. And we have more than twice the rate of sea level rise here. And so it's a huge concern for these contaminated sites on former tidal wetlands.
I can take that question as well. Dom ForsterDTSC. And thank you for your question. I can tell you that that the regional water boards are not using our guidance specifically. However, they are developing an internal document to address sea level rise. I don't know the specific details regarding that document, though. You would need to contact the water board or whatever region your Humboldt Bay is located to discuss those details.
Okay. Our next, thank you so much, Dom, for that clarification. Our next person with a raised hand is Tarnell Abbott. If you can go ahead and unmute your line.
Hi, my name is Tarnell Abbott. I live about a quarter mile or less, actually, from the Zeneca site in Richmond. And I would really urge DTSC to take the precautionary principle to heart and incorporate that into the policy. We don't really know exactly what's going to happen in the future, but things are not looking very good, and sea level rise may well reach a point of what you call the critical severe parameters. We don't know yet, but let's prevent a disaster from happening on our San Francisco Bay shoreline. There's so many vulnerable, highly toxic sites, and the other issue that is of grave concern along our shoreline is the groundwater intrusion. No matter how much sea level rise happens, as long as there is sea level rise, it's going to push the groundwater in and up. And for contaminated sites on the shoreline to be left capped is ridiculous with toxic on site. We know that DTSC has a problem with removing soils, but it has to be done. You can't leave it in vulnerable communities, whether it's humans or wildlife. And I don't see that this is adequately addressed in the policy. So, and also with regards to 6 feet from shoreline, and I didn't hear exactly the word that the gentleman was talking about, but we also have sites that are artificially raised by having fill and having toxic material buried in them. So they're going to look higher, and it's the Zeneca site is certainly one of them, and it's already contaminating the groundwater and the bay and the marsh, and so please follow the precautionary principle and prevent a disaster from happening. One thing that that DTSC gets a little bit there's a little chaos with DTSC, because when you let the RPs drive the science, you're going to get a watered down version that suits their agenda. So you better take a really close look at who you're representing when you're trying to be protective. You're not representing the responsible parties. You need to represent the people and the environment. So please remember that. Thank you
so much, Tarnell. We really appreciate your input, and all the team is listening. We are taking your comments and suggestions as part of this event. So we'll take it to the table. Thank you so much. We appreciate your time, and we're going to go ahead and go to the next person with their hand up. Is Deborah Bayer. Go ahead and unmute your line and go ahead and ask your question. Ms. Bayer.
Okay, hi. Did I do it right?
You did. We can hear you.
Okay, good. All of a sudden I couldn't find my star. So thank you. And what I did this afternoon is I reviewed the last forum, and to listen to it again to get ready for tonight's forum. And I have, I guess, 2 questions. And one again is quoting Dom, who said, we cannot leave toxins in the soil for residential use when it's zoned residential. And I think I asked that, and I didn't get a very clear answer, because of course the Zeneca site it's actually a Superfund site. It was classified as a Superfund site, but California took it over from the feds. So Zeneca has these over 100 harmful chemicals in the soil, and the DTSC has been trying to remediate them, but it hasn't proven successful yet. And I admire your efforts, but the end result is there are still toxic chemicals buried in the soil right near the seashore, within 6 feet of the groundwater and of the upper horizon, I guess, that will become wet with sea level rise and groundwater rise, and yet it's zoned residential. So Dom's statement really, he never answered it to my satisfaction. It was confusing to me. And then the second question I have is, for the last 2 years, HRP, which is the developer of the Zeneca site, the proposed developer, has been trying to sign off on a document with DTSC about financial assurance. And DTSC keeps, first HRP said, oh, how about $13 million? And DTSC said, no. The engineers said, it's nowhere near the kind of financial assurance we needed. They wanted 51. And then I think HRP said, okay, how about 31? But they hadn't specified enough in their financial assurance of what they were going to do. So again, it's been 2 years of the deadline being pushed forward and forward and forward. And my understanding of the document is once it's signed, there is an agreement between the DTSC and the developer that neither side will sue the other side. It's a kind of a waiver of liability. So tell me if that's wrong, if that's not what that document is. But it seems to me that once the DTSC says, okay, this is all you're on the hook for, and then they find out that it's going to cost more than that because the remedy didn't do as much as they thought, that we won't have the financial assurance that makes a responsible party have to clean up the site adequately. I guess for now, that's my questions. Thank you, those two.
Thank you so
Deborah.
much, Deborah. Go ahead and we'll let Dom answer your question about his quote.
Thanks, Deborah. So responding to your first question, what I mentioned was without addressing sea level rise, encroaching water could mobilize and transport contaminants from coastal sites into their surrounding communities. And in order to meet our mission of protection of public health and the environment, that's something that we cannot have happen. That's why we've developed our sea level rise guidance. For the second part of your question, I appreciate the well-formulated question. The focus today is on comments and questions about the sea level rise guidance document itself. Site-specific questions, please contact the project manager directly. If you need that contact information for the site-specific project manager, please email us and we will provide that information to you.
Thanks, Dom. And thank you so much for your question. We're going to go ahead and take one more question from the raised hands, and then we're going to go over to the Q&A box, which will be moderated by John Bystra. I know all of you have been waiting patiently for your questions to be answered from that side. So Sarah Tobin, please go ahead and unmute your line and ask your question or make your comment, please.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
We can. Go ahead.
I'm speaking as a resident of Richmond, California. Richmond is an environmental justice community by any measure, with income disparities, elevated childhood asthma rates, major freeways, a refinery, and multiple Superfund sites, as well as 32 miles of bay shoreline. To give only one example, DTSC's extreme position of leaving contamination in place on the shoreline of the Zeneca site is already increasing our toxic burden by spreading contamination into the neighborhoods and into San Francisco Bay. And so I'm very concerned about the health of future residents and also about the life cycle in San Francisco Bay that is the basis for commercial fishing, crabbing, sport fishing, recreational industries, and community enjoyment. Plus, a dead bay will no longer sequester carbon and will contribute to the climate crisis. So I'd like to follow up on Debbie and Tarnel's comments having to do with toxic waste that's left on the shoreline without lateral containment that threatens people and the planet. So I was very concerned by this draft document because it pledges to use, quote, the best science, unquote, but then, and it lays out the problems very, very nicely, but it doesn't go into the science that they used to reduce their commitment to sea level rise, and it doesn't go into studies of groundwater rise, and instead they're reduced to tape measurements in terms of vertical distance from the site to the level of sea level rise. So in 2020, DTSC signed on to a state estimate of sea level rise that was 7.6 feet by 2100, along with 17 other state agencies, including OPC. And then this draft reduces that estimate substantially to 6 feet. And of course, these estimates are extremely complex. And even according to NOAA, key drivers are not yet well understood, such as ocean heat content or ice mass loss, which Tarnal brought up, or vertical land motion and Gulf Stream changes. But because those considerations aren't explained in the document, then the public is really left in the dark regarding how DTSC is actually applying the best science. And also the problems with groundwater rise. I don't think those can be characterized by merely a tape measurement, because there have to be differences in precipitation, in the density of the soil, in whether it's gravel or whether it's clay. But again, that science doesn't appear in the document. So then it becomes really difficult to trust that DTSC is actually using the best science. And so my last comment is to agree with the previous comments that that to leave to have the responsible parties actually designing and proposing the minimum actions that they would like to take. That's really like foxes guarding hen houses, and there's an inherent conflict of interest in that regard. So I'd appreciate any of your comments, and especially I'd like to know, it just seems kind of obvious that it would be an excellent idea for DTSC to carry out a comprehensive identification and assessment of and a priority list of shoreline sites around the bay, and that could then be used as a logical approach for designing effective protections for California land and people. Thanks for any comments you have.
Dom Forster, DTSC. Sarah, there's a lot to unpack there, and I really appreciate your concern. Let me start with the part regarding site-specific details. When we in the future, when we go to a site and conduct a vulnerability assessment, all of those details in terms of ethology, transmissivity in the soil, groundwater flow, groundwater direction, that is all going to be implemented into the assessment that we conduct. We can't include all of that information for all the soils throughout the state of California, but we can do that for individual sites. So that's going to be a site-specific assessment that's conducted that will include all those details that you mentioned, or that where we will address those details that you mentioned. And the third part of your question, or the other part regarding the 7.6 feet, I think you had mentioned that you had seen that before. When we say 3.5 feet by the year 2050 and 6 feet by the year 2100, those are minimum planning targets. That doesn't mean that that's, if the project manager evaluates the site and determines that we need more, a larger planning projection or a higher planning projection, for example, you mentioned 7.6 feet, then that's something that the PM has the liberty to do. So it's not like we're only using 3.5 and 6 feet. I think perhaps we will clarify that in the next version of our document, because we've had a lot of comments about that, and that's simply not the case. The 3.5 feet by the year 2050, 6 feet by the year 2100 are minimum planning projections only. Hope that answered your questions.
Thanks so much, Dom. We're going to go ahead and transition over to the Q&A feature. So we're going to hand it over to John Bystra. Thank you, Sarah, so much for your comments. We're taking all of this down and we're going to be considering it. Thank you. John?
Thanks, Jerry. And thanks, Dom, and thanks everyone else who has provided input so far, both people in the audience and the presenters. So we'll just start at the top of the list here. We'll go down a couple questions. We'll see what we can help people with here. So first question comes from Stuart Flashman, and he asks, there are many toxic sites vulnerable to sea level rise where a remedy was put forward and approved prior to the current requirement for a Slurva. At what point, if any, will a Slurva be prepared, especially when implementation of the remediation plan has already begun? And I think I'm going to hand this off to Dom, because I think he made reference to this to some degree in the presentation.
Yeah, that's an excellent question, Mr. Flashman. And so what we're going to do for those sites where remedies have already been implemented is if waste is left in place, we revisit those sites and evaluate protectiveness at least every 5 years, if not more frequently. And so for those types of sites, what we would do, we would evaluate that remedy, because it was, let's say it was implemented, I don't know, 5-10 years ago. We will evaluate that site and that remedy to ensure that it's resilient now and into the future. If we conduct that assessment and determine that that remedy is not resilient, then what we're going to ask the RP to do is to develop an adaptation plan so that we can adapt that remedy and make it resilient into the future.
Thanks, Tom.
Jerry or Eric, would you guys like to add to that response? I feel like I'm hogging up all the responses.
No, you're good from my end.
I have nothing more to add.
Great.
Thanks, everyone. Okay, so the next question comes from Skyler Starkolas, and my apologies if I'm messing up your last name. The question is fairly straightforward, two-part. Are there any Slurvas public on Envirostore yet? First part. Second part, if not, when can we expect to start seeing Slurvas on Envirostore? I mean, really, I'll ask this of the group. Dawn, you may know offhand, but I know Greg may be aware. Has anyone seen any Slurvas public on Envirostore yet?
I'll just jump in. I'll jump in quickly, John.
Thanks,
I think it's important to remember that Slurvas may not be identified in the document title as a Slurva. So the list in Envirostore, since it only shows titles, wouldn't jump out as identifying the document as a Slurva. In many cases, Slurva language will be incorporated into other documents. But if you're concerned about a particular, if the questioner is concerned about a specific site.
I would assume that Eric's going to say if the questioner is concerned about a specific site, you can find that project manager on Envirostore and contact them directly. One thing I'd like to add to that, to kind of augment what Eric was saying, is that we're trying to do two different things with Slurvas. We're trying to allow for the possibility that they're both integrated into an existing document, in which case the Slurva wouldn't be obvious unless someone put it in the title of the document. And we want to have a separate activity that we're working on, creating new activities in Envirostore to address sea level rise concerns. So Slurva would be, we're trying to create separate activities for the Slurva and adaptation plans so that when they do appear on Envirostore, it'll be easier for people to find. So that's another option. And I think that answers Skyler's general questions. But one last thing to point out before I go to the next question. So when you say public on Envirostore, normally when a document is final, that's when it appears on Envirostore. So to the best of my knowledge, I don't believe we have any final Slurvas either as part of another document on Envirostore, but there are a lot of sites on Envirostore. And does anyone else know of one that's final already?
Aaron, I'm not aware of any that are final, but there are some draft vulnerability assessments. It's just they're not available for public release until they're final.
Okay, sounds good. Thanks, everyone.
I will add one minor note that we are contemplating some revisions to Envirostore, the bigger picture Envirostore, to help find these sorts of activities in Envirostore. So when those changes get made.
And I'll just add one more thing to that. Recognizing the importance of having an example Slurva or an example adaptation plan, we are working to develop a Slurva and adaptation plan template, which we will be posting to our public website as soon as we finish those templates. So we recognize that it's important to that people are aware of what's included in a Slurva or adaptation plan. So we'll be including those on our website soon, hopefully.
Thanks, everyone. Okay, so going to the third question by Raghu Suribafla. Raghu says, thank you for organizing this webinar. Question, is referencing 6 feet groundwater rise included in the flow chart. Which Cosmos scenario should we use to determine the groundwater rise? And is this threshold of 6 feet related to OPC's 2100 sea level rise number? And Greg?
Greg Neal with DTSC. Yes, the groundwater rise scenario is based upon the USGS Cosmos groundwater model. USGS generated actually a litany of models to model the entire state coastline, and presenting each one of those models in a statewide evaluation, as you might imagine, created some challenges for us. If you use the local mean sea level, or mean high water, mean high water scenario. So in a nutshell, these evaluations are site specific, but the big picture is that we use the USGS models in the web application for 1 meter of sea level rise and 2 meters of sea level rise, which roughly approximate 3 and 6 feet of sea level rise, and that's what's presented. But again, site-specific evaluations, as we've heard, that the state experiences sea level rise differently depending on where you are on the coast. So there's not a single answer to your question, but site-specific evaluation of the project team. But it was an excellent question. Thank you.
Great. So we've got a second question from Stuart Flashman, and this question, this is a little bit, it's got some tooth to it. So let me read through it, and then we'll see what we can do about breaking it down as necessary. So the question starts by saying that the remediation of many toxic sites being addressed by DTSC include capping all or part of the site with a low permeability cap to reduce both infiltration of surface water into the contamination and vapor intrusion of VOCs into the building built above the cap on the site. Yet analysis by Dr. Hill at UC Berkeley indicates that capping a site subject to sea level and groundwater rise, especially when the subterranean water is shallow, can lead to offsite migration of contaminants onto surrounding properties and into the bay. Should DTSC reconsider capping as part of the remediation of sites subject to sea level and groundwater rise, especially when sea level rise estimates are continuing to increase? So you give some context, but the net question is, should DTSC reconsider capping as part of the remediation of sites subject to sea level and groundwater rise, especially when SLR estimates are continuing to increase?
Hey, John, this is Jerry. I'll attempt to answer this question for Stuart. Thanks for this question, Stuart. I appreciate it. I'm Jerry Ahrens. I'm a senior engineering geologist with DTSC. And, you know, I don't have the particular context, but a lot of our sites that have a cap also have something else, including, you know, something that addresses the last part of this statement in this question. There are some sites that have a cap alone, but remember, this process includes revisiting those sites and considering what you know, sea level rise will do to those sites if they don't have anything else other than a cap. But you know, I appreciate what Dr. Hill is pointing out from UC Berkeley with regard to groundwater rise. But not all cap sites are equal. So I really have to drill down, or I encourage you to reach out to the site-specific project manager and find out, you know, what the cap actually entails. Because in my experience, many caps have a soil slurry mix wall or some sort of a vertical component to it that keys down into the first groundwater bearing zone, and or an interior pump and treat system or something that helps route water around the cap. So everything's site specific, but please reach out to your specific site's project manager. You can find through Envirostore or email us, and we can drill down and find the answer. But the answer to your question is yes, DTSC is trying to consider all those things, and this guidance is our guide for project managers to approach the remediation project and the responsible parties and the consultants to take it into account. I hope that answered your question, but I invite anyone else on the panel to jump in for me.
Thanks, Jerry. I think we're still going through some of the questions in the Q&A. John, next.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks. That was a nice comprehensive answer, Jerry. So our next question comes from Skyler Sarkolis again. And the question is, what is an example of a phased adaptation approach? And in what case would this be chosen? There's a second part of the question which reads, and if the adaptation plan is able to be incorporated into other submittals, how will that be made clear? Oh, Dom, why don't you, I think you've spoken piecemeal about the first part of this question. What is an example of a phase adaptation approach, and in what case would this be chosen? You want to take a stab at that?
I can try. Eric or Jerry, feel free to chime in, but I think one example could be perhaps if we had a seawall to protect against inundation, and we didn't want that seawall to be 10 feet immediately because because sea level rise is not an exact science and the projections aren't exact just yet. Maybe we would create a seawall that's only 5 feet tall for now, but have the opportunity in the future to retrofit onto that seawall and make it higher to protect against sea level rise. That's one example I could think of. Eric or Jerry, do you guys have a separate example, perhaps?
Well, I mean,
Another example.
Oh, go ahead. Sorry, Eric.
I was just going to quickly say another example of exactly the same sort might be a site where groundwater is extracted and treated before it's discharged. And with increasing sea level rise, the rate of infiltration would be greater and it would increase over time. And so a phased adaptation would be to add more extraction wells or to increase the capacity of the treatment plant. But it's maybe the flip side of the coin of what Don was just talking about with respect to the seawall.
This is Jerry. I would only add that a phased approach may include, moving that groundwater treatment system to higher ground, or raising the grade of a site that has a cap by another few feet to keep it, accessible, or building roadways or routes to an area of the subject site that needs improvement over time, and or maybe on-site consolidation, or moving the waste package to higher ground and keeping it high and dry for a longer period of time. I mean, it's all site specific, but these are the creative approaches that are going to come out of a Slurva and adaptation plan. The site may not need to improve the site to meet the conditions under the 2100 scenario, but they may, need to do something to meet the more immediate threat in the coming 25 years. And then once again, Dom said we're supposed to look at these at least every 5 years or more often. So we honestly believe a lot of work will be done over time to continue to monitor and make the site protective of public health and the environment. Thank you.
Just to answer
the underlying theme.
Sorry.
I just wanted to add the underlying theme, though, about phase approach is that sea level rise and all of the climate change effects are uncertain. We have good projections from OPC on sea level rise. We're, searching for good comprehensive projections about the other effects of climate change. But really, we don't know. They're just projections. And so for remedies and adaptation of remedies, a phased approach in the face of uncertainty is really the best course. It's the most efficient course for everybody.
And to answer the second part of your question, Skyler, if the adaptation plan is able to be incorporated in other submittals, how will that be made clear? One thing that we have in our toolbox at DTSC is that we don't have to sign off on a remedial decision document unless we agree that sea level rise is being addressed. So one thing that we could ask that the responsible party do is to include a contingency type of a remedy that indicates if sea level rise is X by this year, then we will have a 5 foot, just using my sea level wall example, we'll have a 5 foot sea wall. And if it's Y by this year, we'll have a 10 feet sea level wall. So, I mean, there's ways that we can integrate that into the remedy in terms of a contingency approach.
And just to add to that, because one thing from Skyler's question, it seems like he's trying to make sure that you would be able to tell by searching on Envirostore if the sea level rise vulnerability assessment is actually in another document, like some sort of feasibility study or report or something. And obviously that's something that we're going to have to work with our project managers at DTSC, Skyler, to make sure that if there is a document that is not obviously a sea level rise document, that incorporates language to identify that, say, it contains a vulnerability assessment or it includes an adaptation plan or something like that. So just in case that was what you asked. So I think we got all of that. And thanks everyone for the input. So going to the next question, I'll only just take a couple more and then we'll switch back to raised hands.
Okay.
We've got actually two questions from Nina Allred. The first is more of just a statement saying we need to consider king tide and storm surge considerations, although there are no other details in the guidance on what that would involve.
You know, John, this is Jerry. Once again, Nina, thanks for this question. I want to point out that the 2018 OPC guidance doesn't necessarily have a 3.5 foot that we put into our SLR guidance. For medium high risk aversion, based on the probabilistic projections for 2050, they have a number of 1.9 feet. So I believe in our SLR guidance, using the 3.5 minimum by 2050 actually takes into account king tide and storm surge. And that's how we arrived at that 3.5 number and why it doesn't match with the 2018 OPC projections. I hope that answers your question. Anyone else want to jump in?
Jump in on that. Ella McDougall from Ocean Protection Council. The 3.5 feet is, as Jerry mentioned, a very conservative estimate. We call it a planning target because it's not actually a projection. It's a very high target that we can start from and either go above or below, but it's somewhere that folks can rally around from various regions or various localities where sea level rise is not consistent to begin planning. So, but the idea is that, you know, we don't build a bathtub to exactly the water level where the bath is going to be. You build the tub higher. So that is intended to include things possibly such as storm surge or tidal flooding or atmospheric rivers, etc.
Thanks so much, Ella.
Yeah, thanks everyone for adding to that. We're going to hear from someone new here, Lance McMahon. He sent us a question saying, Dom, I think I heard you say the guidance was being applied at NPL military sites. Does this also apply to non-NPL military sites? I assume he would be referring to FUDs and those sorts of things. Dom?
Yeah. Hi, Lance. Hope all is well. Before I respond, I'd just like to mention that Lance was instrumental in development of our sea level rise guidance back when he used to work for the department. So thanks for your assistance back then, Lance. Happy to answer your question here. Yes, we are for non-NPL sites and NPL sites. For example, we are requesting that Mare Island Naval Shipyard, and I don't want to get into site-specific details, but we have requested that Mare Island Naval Shipyard, for example, address sea level rise at their site. That's an example of a non-NPL military site. I'm not sure how many more sites I need to get into, but particularly in terms of DoD, sea level rise is impacting naval sites as opposed to the other DoD departments. Hope that answers your question, Lance.
Okay, let's go to someone else new on the question front here. Julia Dowell mentions, well, let's see, we've got a couple questions from her. So she mentions at the last listening session, it was mentioned that waste is not typically left in place at sites where there is residential development, and therefore those sites don't need 5-year reviews. She says in her experience, waste has been or is planned to be left in place at many sites where there is planned to be left in place at many sites where there is waste left in place, typically capped, Hunters Point, Treasure Island, AstraZeneca, to name a few. But she has a specific question, and that is, do 5-year reviews continue in perpetuity at residential sites where waste is left in place? And if it is determined that sea level rise or groundwater rise projections are higher than planned for, what steps will be taken to address this? And I'll hand this, I'll say Dom, but definitely see what the group thinks.
Jerry, would you like to answer this question?
Did you say Jerry?
Jerry with the J, would you like to answer this question?
Sure. Well, I do remember the last listening session, and I can't discount or take any counter position from what you're stating here. I heard what you heard, and but my point is, in my experience at DTSC, there are sites with residential development that we've developed and there is waste in place, but that's in my experience. So I can't put words into Dom's mouth, but it isn't unheard of. But with regard to 5-year reviews, yes, as long as DTSC has this instrument over a site, including any kind of land use covenant and or deed restriction, we will require monitoring. And part of that monitoring is checking that the site remains protective of public health and the environment. As time goes by, property ownership changes, and so does our ability to leverage, orders that we have on a site or agreements that we have on our site. But, DTSC and Cal EPA's overarching goal is to maintain sites to be protective of public health and the environment, and use every instrument we have in our capacity as regulators under the statutes to enforce a site to show protectiveness, or else it cannot be occupied. I mean, we have sites that we do, take action against to maintain that semblance of safety and public health. And I'll let anyone else jump in, but our intention is to be able to monitor these into perpetuity, to monitor the groundwater and to make sure protections are in place and take the steps necessary where they're not. I mean, that's our commitment as employees, with the department. And it's what we think about every day, but I'll let others speak.
ForsterDTSC, just to add to what Jerry mentioned, this is a great response, by the way. Typically, 5-year reviews occur in perpetuity at non-residential commercial industrial sites, not necessarily residential sites. However, residential sites where we do have a 5-year review, there's typically a reason why we're having that 5-year review, such as a remedial action or some sort of sub-slab ventilation system, perhaps, that we have to ensure is continuing to function correctly through an O&M plan or such. And so usually for those sites that are residential, oftentimes we evaluate those more than every 5 years. For an O&M, those are sometimes quarterly, semi-annually, annually, and then every 5 years. And so hope that in addition to Jerry's response, answers your question.
Well, I also want to add that not all sites are equal. Not all contaminants are equal. Not all, mechanisms for fate and transport of contamination from a site are equal. Sometimes, the contaminant of concern is can be remedied and contained by leaving it in place, as long as you have a good amount of cover between you and the occupants of that site.
Great answers, guys. Let's go down a little bit more and see what else we've got here. We have a question from Neil Hughes. Neil is asking, I don't know, Neil, I'm being kind of optimistic. I'm not sure if we can answer this question, but right at this time. But when do you expect to have the example Slurva and adaptation plans up on the website? Or could you give an example of how the remedies have been changing at sites with known SLR vulnerability? I think the latter might be easier to answer because I think the first we would be, projecting into the future of what hasn't happened yet, maybe. But can we give an example about how the remedies have been changing at sites with known SLR vulnerability? And that I'll hand that off to anyone because we've got a bunch of people who are working on sites that are on the coast. So
this is Jerry once again. I'll say we're early in the process of leveraging this guidance onto our projects and through our project managers, and we are at a starting point. So it's a learning process. But in my experience, at least at one site, we're looking at the vulnerabilities, but it's from current present day issues and making the RPs prove that there isn't release to the environment or threats to public health in the environment. So the Slurvas are helping us focus and making us acutely aware of the limitations of a remedy and our desire to bolster, improve upon, add more alternatives and go to greater lengths to ensure the site's protective over time. Because remember, in that evaluation we go through the National Hazard Substances Pollution Contingency Plan, the National NCP Plan, and the threshold criteria is overall protection of public health and the environment, and then compliance with the applicable or relevant and appropriate standards. So it is, in my opinion, something that is making us work harder on remedies than we ever have before.
Thanks, Jerry. Let's take a couple more questions here and see what we can answer. Beryl Golden asks an excellent question. I will hand this off to the geologist. Couldn't groundwater flow direction change with sea level rise?
Yeah, absolutely, it can. Water just wants to flow from high to low head, from high pressure to low pressure. It takes the path of least resistance. And if you change the incline of that wedge or change the slope of the table, water can certainly flow in an opposite direction. We see changing gradients seasonally at sites, depending on that phenomenon. Water just wants to take the path of least resistance, and when it's hammed up on one side, it'll reverse course, certainly.
And just to add to that, in a general sense, that's part of one of the reasons why evaluating sea level rise is important, because if it can cause groundwater gradients to change direction, that's something that needs to be considered to make sure that our remedies remain protective over time. So thanks for the answer, Jerry, and thanks for the question, Beryl. Okay, got another question here. This is from Tracy Abbott. And Tamil asks, when will the OPC update be completed? I assume Tamil is speaking about, my apologies, it's not Tamil, it's Tarnal. This text is really small, so I apologize. When will the OPC update be completed? I assume they're talking about the 2023 update. before finalization of the SLR guidance. And when Tarnal says that, I assume they're talking about DTSC's guidance. I think that it might be appropriate for Ella to answer the first part of that question.
Definitely, I can nail the first part of that question. So the 2023 guidance is actively being worked on right now. There is a draft that's being reviewed by a couple of state agencies through the Sea Level Rise Collaborative. It will be out for public comment later this month if everything goes well. Fingers crossed, everything goes perfectly well. And then adjustments will be made, and it should be adopted by the Ocean Protection Council on December 12th and made final and public going into 2024. Now, I don't know necessarily how it will dovetail with DTSC's guidance, so I'll toss it back to them.
Yeah, so the second part of that question was, will OPC's update be completed before finalization of SLR guidance? And that, Dom, I'll give that to you, though I have, though that word finalization might be interpretable.
Finalization of the TSC SLR guidance?
Yes.
Yeah, finalization. We are anticipating to finalize that guidance in the first quarter of 2024, approximately like 2 to 3 months after after comments have been all comments have been received.
And the one thing I'd reiterate about that too is that obviously our guidance, because it can evolve over time, while we may call it final, it doesn't mean that we'll never update it. The whole idea is the science changes, as best management practices change, that we would update that guidance. So using the word finalization always seems a little bit weird when you want something to evolve over time. So just throw that in there. We'll take one more question from the Q&A, and then we'll hand it back to Jerry with G to some raised hands answered. So thanks for your question, Tarno. Going to a new questioner, we have Colleen Mackin, who asks, or first says, thank you for this webinar as a follow-up to the one in the spring. Well, this isn't really a question, it's just a statement. We could provide feedback on it, though. She would suggest that we consider another update in 6 months to review ever-changing circumstances.
That's a really good suggestion, and we'll definitely take it to the table. I want to thank everyone for being here again. I know that public input for this document's progress is really important. So we're going to go ahead and continue on to the raised hands. Thanks, John, so much. The phone number ending in 352, I see your hand up. Please go ahead and press *6 on your phone to unmute and ask your question. And please, if you could tell us what your name is.
Hi, can you hear me?
Your voice is very low. If you could speak up.
Okay, I'll pick up my phone. Can you hear me better?
That is better. What's your name?
Okay. My name is Margaret Child, and
Welcome, Margaret.
My question actually should be pretty simple. It has to do with the format of this discussion, and that is that I'm not hearing a lot of you guys clearly, and I wondered if there's any way that you could give us a transcript of the questions and the answers. I mean, it seems that might be asking a whole lot, but I thought I would just ask it anyway.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a really good point to bring up too. When this webinar is concluded, the recording of the webinar will be posted on the webpage. We'll be sending out an announcement to everyone who's registered that the video is available to review, and the video does have a transcript attached. So whatever email that you use to register for this event, you will get a notification of when the recording is ready.
Yeah, okay. And one more question has to do with, it seems as though, I've been working a lot with the folks on the Zeneca site, so that's really my reference point. And it seems that the DTSC is falling behind. You know, they're not holding the HRT accountable for the funds, and there also have been a lot of instances where there's supposed to be a 5-year study of something, and we have several instances of those not happening. So when somebody says, "Oh, we're going to do a 5-year review," I go, "Yeah." And judging by past experience, those are not, those don't happen, and people are not being held accountable the way I would like that to happen. So can somebody give me some comments on that?
Sure, I can.
Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead, Tom.
Sure, I can comment. I apologize that you haven't received feedback for 5-year reviews on other sites. I'm unaware of those sites. You know, our focus today though is on comments or questions about the guidance document. For site-specific questions, again, you can please reach out to the project manager for whichever site you're referring to. That'd be great because that person's going to have the site-specific information that we don't have. If you need the contact information for that project manager, you can email us and we'll provide that to you as soon as possible.
Thank you so much for your question, Margaret. Do you have anything to add, Jerry, or we're going to go ahead and move on then? Okay.
No.
Great. So in the raised hands, we have Stan, I want to say your name right, Philippi. I'm assuming it's like the actor Ryan Philippi. You go ahead and unmute your audio and ask your question. And if I said your name wrong, I apologize.
Which one did I raise my hand for?
Whatever question you want to ask at this time.
Okay, well, first of all, thanks for doing this. I used to work in the site cleanup program there for years. What are you going to do about some of those real old sites from the 80s when we were just starting and some of them were done under enforcement program? And I don't know that they all made it into, you know, state Superfund status or other databases.
Really good question. I will go right to Dom. Maybe that's something you can answer.
Yeah, that's a very good question, Stan. You know, I referenced or alluded to some numbers earlier in the presentation regarding active sites, but we are going to, in the future, need to address historical sites. And that's something that we are working on behind the scenes. And that certainly, you know, we don't want those historical sites to fall by the wayside without being assessed for, you know, sea level rise vulnerabilities. So that's something that we at DTSC anticipate on conducting in the future, is those assessments.
Okay, good.
That's a great question, Stan.
Well, some of those real old ones were just like put up a parking lot, you know. Okay, thank you.
Thanks so much, Stan. You also have a couple more questions in the Q&A. Do you want to go ahead and ask those now, or do you want us to reply to you in writing?
Well, I guess, some of the sites that you're still working on were ones I worked on in 1982. And so, you know, this stuff takes a long time. And so if you want somebody to get on with some of the worst sites in some of the most vulnerable areas before things get too wet, will you be requiring them to do this pretty soon?
Can you repeat that again, Stan? Sorry, I missed that.
Well, I just thinking about how long it takes to get some of these sites completed from start to finish, because some of them we started and they're still going on. Right. So will some of these old sites that are the most, I don't know if are you prioritizing them?
Yeah, that's another great question, Stan. It's exactly what we plan on doing. I can't reveal everything at this moment, but we are behind the scenes. We're working on evaluating the sites and prioritizing them based on vulnerability. I can say that. That's something we're completely aware of, you know, and we are understanding that there are historic sites out there that we need to address. We can't just let them fall by the wayside, like I mentioned before.
Okay, well, good job. Thanks. I'm glad you're doing it. This was one of my soapbox items when I left the department in 2010. Take it
Thank
easy.
you so much, Stan. Thank you for being with us tonight. We really appreciate your time and
Sure.
all of your input. Thank you.
Appreciate it.
So at this time, we're going to go ahead and move to the next raised hand, Mr. Raghu. I will go ahead and unmute your line and ask your question.
Oh, thanks again. I think I'm getting the second opportunity to ask an extra question, so I appreciate this webinar. Quick question related to, will there be guidance on how to address specific elements of a conceptual site model update? For example, we've talked about the hydraulic impacts. Will there be additional guidance on addressing the geochemical and potential biogeochemical impacts or changes from sea level rise?
Thank you so much. You have also, I think you had a question in the Q&A box, but I'm hoping that got it answered.
Yeah, maybe if I could I was hearing kind of his voice in and out a little bit, so I might have only picked up a little bit of it. But I think big picture, the question was, are we going to include specific items in the guidance? And I would suggest the answer to that is no, we are not including specific elements or specific flooding scenarios or anything like that in the guidance, because all of these are site-specific evaluations. There isn't a, as Dom mentioned earlier, there's no way for us to include all the potentials in a statewide guidance. So each of these will be a site-specific evaluation by the team that's been assigned by DTS.
Thanks so much, Greg. Does anyone else have something to add?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Apologies. Go ahead. Unmute. Okay.
I hope I'm coming through clearly now. My question was related to the conceptual site model. Any guidance as to what kind of changes or what kind of potential changes you'd want us to include in those? So, for example, hydraulic impacts is one certainly that we do, but any geochemical and or biogeochemical impacts from sea level rise.
Thank you so much. I think, let's see. Next person with hands up is Mr. Lance McMahon. Go ahead and unmute your line and ask your question, please.
Hello, everyone. Good to hear your voices again.
Hey, Lance.
Hey, Dom. So one question that I think Stan was trying to ask, it was about sites that are outside of the cleanup program. And I'm pretty sure this guidance does not address that. And I'm curious as to the department's plan for addressing those non-cleanup sites. When is that coming out?
Question.
That's a good question, Lance. Are you referring to, for example, like hazardous waste management program sites or permitted sites?
Yes.
Yeah, so they are aware of the guide. I mean, we've coordinated with them when we developed our guidance for SMRP, and their plan is to either, I don't know their specific plan, it's either though to take the guidance and adopt that for for HWMP, but of course they would need to revise the guidance, and they haven't done that yet. I'm not sure exactly if or when there's a plan to do that though. I don't know, Greg or Jerry or Eric, do you guys recall when exactly HWMP was going to develop? I know that they're aware of our guidance, and we included them in review of our guidance. I just don't know that they're developing one specifically just yet, or if they plan to take ours and adopt it and slightly modify it so it fits their program.
Okay.
Just as an addition to that, There are communications between the Hazardous Waste Management Program and the cleanup program, but again, as Dom mentioned, they are working on their own guidance, so we don't have that information.
Well,
Also, I think Lance, another component to that is some of the permitted facilities that the regional boards oversee. I know that they're working on sea level rise guidance type document as well. I know, for example, Region 2 has a draft currently, but it's not yet available for public consumption. But that's something that they're also working on.
Okay, that's great. And there was another question I had. I dropped it into chat, and I think it got skipped over. And that was about the public availability of documents that the responsible parties have submitted. My understanding is those documents may not be available on Envirostore, but they are public records. True?
Lance, this is John. Are you talking about draft documents or final documents?
So if someone submits a feasibility study, for example, that deals with this topic, it's a publicly available record, even though it's not available on Envirostore because of the way Envirostore is set up. Or am I missing something?
Well, one thing I would say is that, so somebody submits a document to us. We don't know yet whether it's something that we would approve. We would, we consider it draft. So because it's a deliberative product, it's not normally something we would release on Envirostore or even in general to the public, unless it was specifically like someone knew about it and specifically requested it. Because quite often, let's say they submit a draft document to us, we end up not approving it because it's got flaws in it. That, I think, is the reason why draft documents don't normally pop up on Envirostore, but it could be based on that document that they finalize a document, which we do approve of, so that final document would appear on Envirostore as, because we call it final, it would appear there. And the draft document, while it's not deleted from the admin record, so if someone wanted to go look for it, they might be able to get it. We don't. I think part of it is not wanting to have multiple versions of the same document, especially since if they're all multiple versions and we only approve one of them, we don't want to make it seem like previous versions that DTSC didn't approve of are somehow just as valid as the final document we approved. So that's what that's my kind of general response to that. I don't know if someone else has additional detail that they'd like to add.
Well, John, I think you actually answered the question early on in that statement. And that is, yes, it's a public record. It's just not on Envirostore. And if someone knows about it, they can request it.
Yeah, very true. That's it.
Great. Thanks so much. So Lance, you do have I want to just take this opportunity, since you have your audio open. If there's any outstanding questions that you have in the Q&A, do you want to go ahead and ask them now, or do you want us to reply to you in writing?
No, I think you've actually answered them either by answering me directly or answering someone else.
Okay, great. Thanks so much for your time. We appreciate all your input.
Thanks, Lance.
At this time, I do want to go back and ask Raghu. I think that we preemptively went to the next person before finishing your question. So I have enabled your audio. If you want to go ahead and re-ask your question or ask the last part of your question again, go ahead, please.
Yeah, thank you, Jerry. I hope my audio is clearer now.
You are very clear.
Yeah, I was referring to the conceptual site model. What kind of guidance will the document have? How do we address changes or impacts from sea level rise to conceptual site model elements? I was just saying, right now we understand the hydraulics of it, but I think the geochemistry and potential impacts to biogeochemistry, those are probably not as well understood. So I'm curious if that will be discussed in the guidance.
Thanks so much. I appreciate your patience with us too. We're going to go ahead and go to Eric for this. Mr. Vanderbilt, you look like your video is frozen. I think he was
Or
having
so-
a little bit of connection issue. Oh, hi, Eric, you're back.
Hi.
Okay. Go ahead.
Sorry, hope you can hear me. Yes, I am having
Yes.
connection issues. I'll try to squeeze this in before I lose it again. Raghu, thanks for your question. I'll just share a little bit of a backstory about how the team has worked. It was about 6 or 8 months ago that we decided we needed a checklist. We thought it would be useful for the project managers to have a checklist to be able to review incoming Slurvas and determine if they were satisfactory. And we struggled with that and couldn't really come up with one. And the reason, it's multi-part reason actually, but a lot of it gets to do with the question you're asking, which is what specific elements would be included in a conceptual site model that DTSC would care about when considering sea level rise vulnerability. And so, yes, as you say, hydraulic changes due to sea level rise would certainly be one, but others like geochemical changes as a result of the saline environment, multiple others. We can't make a list. The nature is too varied and sites are too varied, and we really need the professional judgment of the consultant working on a specific site to come forward with their best estimate of what factors are important and include those in the exposure pathways on the conceptual site model. And as you say, as we learn more, then we will ask for more during the 5-year review. It will be an evolving process, and together, DTSC and the professional community will, I think, come together with better adaptations as time moves along.
And I'll just add to Eric's response. That checklist is going to be integrated in the template that eventually we will be including on our public website. So in the future, that will be available. It's just not ready at this moment. Stay tuned because we will have that here in the near future.
Thanks.
Great question, by the way.
Thanks, team. And we're going to go to the next raised hand, which is Skyler Sakulis. Go ahead and unmute your audio. I do see that you have a question in the Q&A. So if you want to start with that one, go ahead.
Yeah, that's actually what I was going to ask. Thank you. Sure. So in reference to groundwater rise, there's a recent report from May 2023 called Rising Coastal Groundwater as a Result of Sea Level Rise Will Influence Contaminated Coastal Sites and Underground Infrastructure. And it states that in San Francisco Bay Area, they found that groundwater rise is predicted to impact twice as much land area as inundation from sea level rise, and 5,282 additional site-managed sites of contamination may be vulnerable to inundation from groundwater rise in a 1-meter sea level rise scenario. So will this report and its data be considered in the DTSC guidance? And can DTSC include explicit groundwater rise data and projections in their guidance?
Thanks so much.
This is Dom.
Go ahead.
This is Dom Forrester, DTSC. You're not going to respond to that specifically within our guidance. However, project managers that oversee or regulate sites within the San Francisco Bay Area can certainly consider that. What was it? An article, or was it a report from May 2023? I mean, they can certainly consider that, but that's not something that we're integrating within our guidance. And then the second part of your question, can DTSC include explicit groundwater remediation data and projection in their guidance? Yes, we are going to include empirical data within our projection, not in the guidance, but for site-specific assessments and adaptation planning. That's certainly something that we would consider. Does that answer your question? We wouldn't include site-specific groundwater data in the guidance, though.
Okay.
Still there, Skyler? Yeah.
Yeah, I understand that groundwater changes is site specific, but will there be mention of specifically how sea level rise can affect groundwater rise, and in what ways, and how groundwater rise can become present and show flooding before sea level rise?
Does our sea level rise team geologist want to take a stab at that one, Barry?
Sure. Well, this is an excellent question, Skyler, and I will say this: it's not a forgot or left out. We're familiar with the May 2023 document report that you described. And so, you know, remember, we're approaching all sites that may be inundated with this guidance, and part of the evaluation is going to look at groundwater, and anticipating groundwater will rise over time due to increased rain events, storm events, and also the fact that, you know, we know that the groundwater rides on top of the sea water, and that there's, you know, tidal effects for these sites. So it's not a forgot or left out. It is on our mind, and we have not forgot about the groundwater term in our Slurva or vulnerability assessment. It's our major concern, because remember, we're concerned about the fate and transport of contaminants of concern left at a site. And when what was once high and dry becomes inundated, we are going to want to know from the responsible parties and their consultants how they plan on dealing with that, and how that's going to be addressed, and how they're going to respond to those new inputs. I hope that answered your question, Skyler.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. I guess the last thing I would say is just that to make it, especially in the sea level rise evaluation remedy phase instructions, that it just explicitly states that groundwater rise should also be assessed. But thank you.
Thank you
You're
so
welcome.
much, Skyler. Thanks, team. At this time, we're going to move back to the Q&A. I'm going to hand it back to our moderator, John Beistra. John?
Thanks, Jerry. So we're going to keep going through questions that people had, ones we haven't answered before. One thing to note, you know, if somebody's asked a question, as Skyler just did, you know, they're and we answered it verbally, like because they or say like Lance, we'll mark those questions as answered because we answered them live. So just letting you know. So let's go back to our list here. Let me just take a quick look through it. This is a good question. Unfortunately, I can't name the attendee because it's an anonymous attendee, but it's a good question nonetheless. Will DTSC or but DTSC require the assessments and other submittals, presumably, you know, vulnerability assessments and those sort of submittals, to be under the signature of a registered engineer or similar professional? I'll just take an initial stab at it. So the Business and Professions Code guides what documents that people submit to us have to be stamped or signed and stamped by either a registered professional geologist or a registered professional engineer who is registered in California. So if that's one of those documents, which I believe it would be, then yes, we would look to making that a requirement. Does somebody else on the panel have a dissenting opinion or another thought on the matter?
This is Eric. Can you read the question again?
Yeah. So will DTSC require the assessments and other submittals, I assume as part of the sea level rise guidance, to be under the signature of a registered engineer or similar professional? So the assessments submitted to us, will it require an engineer or professional geologist signature?
Okay, thanks for the reread. Yeah, I'll just add that I completely agree with John's answer. Emphatically, the answer is yes.
And you know, that was a great answer by Eric and John, and I'll just add as well that when we receive documents such as Slurvas or adaptation plans in the future, those will be routed through our internal consultative engineering services group and geological services group, most of all which are licensed professionals. So to answer the question, same thing as John and Eric mentioned is yes, for sure.
Thanks, guys. Okay, so let's go to someone who I think I don't know if this I think this person asked a question via raising their hand, Jen Kalt, but it's a follow-up from a point that was made. So I think it's a good question here. Jen Kalt states, the discussion referencing seawalls makes me wonder, is DTSC soliciting input from the Coastal Commission and the BCDC? Seawalls would require permits from those agencies and could cause unintended consequences like erosion on adjacent properties that need to be considered. So are we soliciting input from the Coastal Commission and BCDC? I think Dom would be the best person to answer this question.
I can answer that. Dom Forster, DTSC. When I mentioned seawall, that was just an example. I was not getting into any site-specific details regarding a site with the seawall. Regarding coordination with Coastal Commission and BCDC, he provided our draft sea level rise guidance to both the California Coastal Commission and BCDC for comment, for edits and comments, and we received those and integrated their comments a few months back. So yes, we are considering their input and soliciting their input.
Yeah. And maybe more a bit of a more response. Eric Vanderbilt with DTSC. DTSC would never. I mean, I think the question sort of gave the flavor that DTSC, in response to sea level rise, is going to unilaterally demand seawalls from property owners all around the bay, and that will never happen. DTSC will never require a seawall to be built without all required permits being obtained, and especially from those agencies, the Coastal Commission and BCDC.
Nice add-on, Eric. Very nice. Yeah, thanks for the question, Jen. Okay. So I know that Stan was on the phone, Stan Philippe. But he brings up another question that's a good question. And I think it may be because we're using language that's a little bit loose while we're talking about this. But he asked, will you require or request the assessments, etc.? You know, will we require these documents from the responsible parties or from, the entity in charge, whoever that may be? What do you think, Dom?
I'm Forster, DTSC. I think that in accordance with CERCLA, the NCP, and state hazardous waste control laws, we believe that remedies should be protective both in the short term and long term. Therefore, it's something that we're going to require RPs complete for those sites. If we believe that a remedy is not protective in the long term because sea level rise is an issue, we're not going to sign off on any remedy decision document for that site.
And just to follow up on what Dom said for you, Stan, you were with DTSC and you may understand the process, but at the beginning of each fiscal year, the project manager in DTSC meets with the RP and their consultant, and they lay out a schedule, scope, and estimate of the work that needs to get done in the coming fiscal year. And so those elements that show up, and are locked down in the contractual agreement for a standard or agreement and other enforcement cases, they're put on notice that these are the deliverables we expect in the coming year. And if there are times where things get pushed out another year, if it's required, it's required. It's not a request.
Good answer, guys. Hope that answers your question, Stan. Let's see. We're running low here. Let's we'll go back. I believe that I asked some questions with raised hand, but this is a follow-up, I think, to our last session. So Deborah states that Jerry Ahrens, said last March that if DTSC finds in the 5-year review or monitoring that the remedy is not working adequately, there are other options that can be implemented. Then he said they might be expensive. I would like assurance that the RP would be ordered to implement the extra remedy and pay for it, even though it might cost more than was originally agreed to by the developer.
Well, you put me on the spot, Deborah, and I appreciate that. That's a very good question. I did say that. I can only reiterate that DTSC will work within the law and our statutory authority to enforce a site to be protective of public health and the environment. And remember, under that NCP criteria, cost is a criteria, but it's not the only criteria. And so, remember that RPs are trying to protect their property as well. But, there are instances where unfortunately, the RP cannot afford to do everything that's required. And they look for options. They look for ways out. And we've experienced that within DTSC, where a responsible party, cut and run and claimed bankruptcy, and it created a scenario where state funds had to be paid to remedy a site. So I can't really speak to, every instance, because every instance is unique, but DTSC does bring everything we have to bear on an RP to get them to get that site into compliance and be protected. I hope that answers your question, but maybe someone else would like to jump in.
Can I offer a little bit more, Jerry, for Deborah? Just as a procedural matter, during each 5-year review, it is certainly within DTSC's authority to ask for a revision on the cost estimate for the remedy. And so I think that would be the mechanism that would address the concern that you're sharing with us, Deborah. And then, Deborah, if it's okay, I wanted to circle back on a question you asked in the first hour of the webinar. You'll recall you were asking about the procedure for financial assurance agreements, and it was your understanding that at the conclusion of a financial assurance agreement, both parties, the state and the property's responsible party, typically execute a waiver of liability. Do I have that right? I don't know if you're on, if you're muted or not, but I think that was the nature of your question.
I think she's naturally muted, but
I see. Okay, well, I'll just proceed.
I think that is the nature of what she asked.
Yes. Yeah, I'll cross my fingers that I'm on the right track here. I just wanted to say that I looked at the DTSC's standard voluntary cleanup agreement. We have one on our website. It's just the standard template that's generally referred to in every case, although it can be adjusted. But the standard template has language that says that the agreement does not constitute a covenant not to sue, and within the agreement, DTSC reserves all rights and powers. So I don't think that your characterization was right about financial assurances typically resulting in a hands-off agreement between DTSC and the RP. I think it's the opposite, that DTSC maintains its ability to seek more funds if conditions change.
And I am not a DTSC lawyer, and I'm not giving legal advice, but I've been involved with projects where this covenant not to sue, it is some sort of separate legal agreement. And in the examples that I've seen it used in, we're fairly limited, where it normally has been agreed upon between DTSC and another party when the other party was not the responsible party who contaminated the site. They were something like someone who was leasing the property or something like that. And the nature of their business was that they would not be contributors to the contamination now or in the future. So I agree with what Eric says, though, like unless even if we sign some sort of covenant not to sue, I think we all appreciate that the law can be very complex, and it's something that DTSC would not enter into lightly, and we wouldn't enter into likely if it were a party who is somehow even partially responsible for the contamination at the site. Great answer though, Eric. Thank you.
Okay, thank you guys so much. We are at 7:55 at this time. I want to thank everyone for all of their questions. If there were questions that we didn't get to in the Q&A that require a written response, we'll be sending that response to you via email from your registration. But wait, before we do that, I'm going to go ahead and ask Nina to unmute and just let me know if there's something that if you wanted to ask that was not in the Q&A that you typed in already, and we can address it fairly quickly. You're unmuted, go ahead.
Oh, hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, thank you. It was just my Q&A question, and it was for Ella. Is it okay if I ask it really quick?
Go right ahead.
Thank you. Thank you so much for responding about the tidal king tides and storm surge. I was wondering if I were to do the San Francisco sea level rise scenario for 2100, I saw it 6.9 feet, and I was wondering if that includes storm surge and king tide as well. Or is it purely just 6.9 and I need to use like the ART tool or some sort of projection to evaluate storm surge and king tide?
Yeah, hey Nina. The 2018 OPC guidance does not include a quantification of storm surge or king tides. I would recommend using those projection levels and then adding a tool on top, as you suggested, ART or Cosmos. And then the 2023 guidance, which is coming out later this year or early next year, that will have a little more detail on how to incorporate groundwater, storm surge, king tides, all of that. So we're working on developing that, but again, it's really hard to incorporate, projection tables or scenario projections with those specific factors. So that's where it's at right now. I would suggest using tools and layering. Thanks for your question.
So much. So just a really quick recap, that means 3.5 feet in 2050, I don't need to do a king tide or storm surge scenario because it's already incorporated. And for 2100, if I use 6.9, I should do a scenario with king tide and storm surge.
No, the 3.5 does not necessarily include storm surge or king tides. That's simply a planning target. If you want, I can ask folks to connect us by email and we can chat offline.
Sounds great. Thank you. All right. Thank you all.
You're welcome. And we'll get the email for Nina to you, Ella, afterwards. Okay. So at this time, we're going to go ahead and take all the questions that were left in the Q&A. We'll be emailing people the written responses. And then for the next slide, please. I just want to recap and go back to what Dom was saying earlier about all the tools that are available on the Sea Level Rise webpage for you to view. And there's also public comment survey tool that you can put in a written response if you think of something later, if you want to re-ask your question. All of these avenues go to the Sea Level Rise team. In addition, we have a survey about public engagement. Like, is this format working for you? Is this something that we want to change up? Is this, those kinds of, things we want to hear back from you about the engagement that Sea Level Rise team is trying to coordinate with you. And of course, we're always welcome of your emails. So if you don't want to submit to comment form, you can just email us. That works perfectly fine too. And then for future events, we really want to encourage you to subscribe to our e-list so that you can get notified about these events or any updates to the guidance. And last but not least, after we close this webinar, you'll see a pop-up for some feedback on this particular webinar. So if you can take a couple minutes, that will be really, really helpful. And we're sharing all the links in the chat for you. And right now I'm going to hand it off to Dom for some closing remarks.
Wow, that was certainly an engaging conversation today, everyone. Thank you all for this. And we heard about sea level rise minimum planning targets versus projections. We talked a bit about phased adaptation and adaptation planning. Also about the forthcoming Slurva and adaptation plan templates. Just like to mention, we're going to get back to you all with written responses from the Q&A as soon as we can. And certainly look forward to addressing all the helpful, informative written comments that we've received. Remember, the public comment period is open all the way through October 31st, a little more than a month and a half away from now. So there's still time to get your comments in. And again, we'd like to mention, thank you everyone for attending today. We really appreciate it, and we really appreciate the feedback.
Thanks, Dom. So we'll go ahead and move over to the last slide. And again, I want to thank everyone. I think that this has been a really good event. I appreciate all your time, especially with all the virtual meetings happening. A lot of us are still doing things remotely. So taking time out of your evening, we really appreciate your time. And I also want to take a moment to thank all of the DTSC team members that make these kinds of events possible, not just program, but also all of our helpers on the other side of the Zoom wall. Thank you so much. Please stay safe and be well. Good night, everyone.